Hello, this is Shade Slayer 7742 on YouTube, and I've decided to start a new series called Shade Reads. Now, this is probably different than most things you'll probably see on YouTube if you're an avid YouTube watcher. At first, I wanted to get into the abridged series scene, but slowly I will make my own niche in YouTube in a way that I guess I find expressive. Now, this is going to be when I choose a book or book series that may or may not have an actual recorded version of in MP3 or CD format. It may never have been recorded. In general, I am not taking credit for the recording or taking any profits from this. In fact, I'm going to try as much as I can to choose books that have not actually been recorded and not something you can buy in a store, so to avoid copyright issues. The book series that I'm choosing at the moment is the Johnny Dixon mystery series, the kids supernatural series created by a man called John Bellairs. You probably haven't heard of him, but in case, and if even if you have, I'm gonna explain a bit about him. He was kind of overshadowed by J.R.R. Tolkien back when he was writing, and most of his books after the eighth Johnny Dixon novel were actually published by his illustrator, Mr. Brett Helquist. Now, these books were generally like young adult mystery novels with supernatural things thrown in, kind of a gothic horror kind of vibe. It involved a young bespectacled nerd e-boy named Johnny Dixon. Took place in 1940s, 1950s, um, in in the New England area. Uh, just so you know, I do not take credit for any of this. It belongs to Mr. Helquist and Mr. Bellairs, respectively. And I hope you enjoy this, as I'm hoping to enjoy this. And here's the first book, and personally one of my favorites. It's called The Curse of the Blue Figurine. And this is the very first in the Johnny Dixon series. So let's start this off. Chapter 1. It was a cold winter evening in January. The year was 1951. A short, pale, bespectacled boy named Johnny Dixon was sitting in a big comfy easy chair in the parlor of his grandparents' house. Outside it was snowing. Through the bay window you could see the flakes falling. The room was dark except for the faint yellow light that shone from the fan-shaped dial on the front of the big walnut Atwater Kent table model radio that was next to the easy chair. Johnny's eyes were wide open. He was staring into the darkness and listening intently to the program. On his lap was a plate of Ritz crackers spread with pink pimento-flavored cream cheese. Johnny always munched while he listened to the radio. This evening he was listening to one of his favorite programs, The House of Mystery. In this episode, Sir Philip Stapleton, the renowned archaeologist, had entered the forbidden temple of Kali in the jungles of India. With him was Inspector Marcus Corley of Scotland Yard, who had travelled all the way from London to help Professor Stapleton unravel the mystery of the savage killings that had plagued Delhi recently. The temple was dark. Each footstep that two men took raised endless, sinister echoes. Suddenly, at the far end of the pillared hall, something began to glow eerily. It was a huge statue of the four-armed goddess Kali. Now, as the two men stood frozen in their tracks, the statue began to move, its arms slowly back and forth, and a hideous, croaking voice chanted, Yama, Yama. Professor Stapleton's voice was an incredulous gasp. What is it? What can it mean? Inspector Corley answered grimly, Yama means death. It means death. And then, Johnny, didn't you hear me? I've called you 3 times. Your grandpa and I are waiting, and your dinner's getting cold. Johnny looked up startled. He really hadn't heard his grandmother calling. With a sad sigh, he turned off the radio. He got up and brushed away some cracker crumbs. Then, meekly with the plate in his hand, he followed his grandmother out to the dining room. A few minutes later, Johnny was sitting at the big mahogany dining room table with his grandfather and grandmother. As usual, Grandpa sat at the end by the window, in the chair with the arms. Grandpa was a tall, slightly stooped old man, who always wore gray work shorts and gray wash pants. He had a high freckled forehead, and on his big sunburnt nose was perched a pair of gold-rimmed glasses. A few strands of white hair were strung carefully across the top of his head. Loose wrinkled flesh hung down in wattles from his cheeks, and his large hands were covered with brown freckles. Grandpa was 74 years old. He was old, but he was cheerful most of the time. He sang songs like "Oh, Susanna" and "Peter Gray," and went on long walks all over the town with Johnny. He listened to baseball games with Johnny and helped him with his homework and played checkers and cribbage with him. Grandpa was a good egg. He was almost like a father to Johnny, which was a good thing because, these days, he was just about the only father that Johnny had, and Grandma, for that matter, was the only mother he did have. Up until So Johnny went north. Up until about 6 months before, Johnny had lived in New York State in the town of Riverhead on Long Island. But then his mother got sick and died of cancer. At first it seemed to Johnny as if the world had come to an end. Then, as the shock and grief wore off, he began to think that he was getting used to the idea of living alone with his dad. But the Korean War changed things. Johnny's father had been a bomber pilot during World War II. So the Air Force asked Mr. Dixon to come back and serve again, this time as jet pilot. Mr. Dixon could have refused. He was the sole surviving parent of a child under the age of 18, but Mr. Dixon was itching to get into the cockpit of a fighter plane. And when he found out that Grandma and Grandpa Dixon would be happy to take care of Johnny, his mind was made up. So Johnny went north to the town of Dustin Heights, Massachusetts, to live with his grandparents. It had been hard for Johnny to adjust to his new surroundings. He felt lonely a lot of the time, and he was a little scared. But Grandma and Grandpa had been as nice as they could be to him, and that helped a lot. Johnny smiled happily as Grandma spooned mashed potatoes onto his plate. It was snowing outside, and it was warm and comfy in the big old house. A coal fire was roaring in the furnace in the basement, and the register on the floor breathed warm air into the room. The black sessions clock on the sideboard ticked quietly and reassuringly. The dining room table was covered with a white linen cloth, and on it were good things to eat: roast beef, cabbage salad, mashed potatoes, and plenty of thick, dark brown gravy. And for dessert, there would either be chocolate pudding or lemon meringue pie. The food that Grandma Dixon made tended to be the same, day after day, but it was always good. As they ate, Grandma and Grandpa talked quietly. Sometimes they talked about things that Johnny liked to talk about. But this evening they were chewing over some local gossip about what so-and-so down the street was doing. Johnny thought all this very dull, so he just munched and drank and went back to living in his own little dream world. He thought about how great it would be to be an archaeologist. That was what he wanted to be right now, more than anything in the world. He imagined himself with a pith helmet on his head and a pickaxe in his hand, wading through sand while the hot sun sizzled in the sky, or exploring by moonlight, which was much more dramatic. Johnny saw himself wandering among the columned halls of the temples of Dendor or Karnak at night, when a pale silvery sheen fell upon the mysterious hieroglyphs and the carved shapes of pharaohs and beast-headed gods. Was there danger here? Who could tell? What if a shape wrapped in tattered bandages stepped from the shadows and confronted him? What would Professor John Wellesley Dixon, Ph.D., do? Of course, there was the large British Army service revolver in the holster that hung from his belt, but it would not be much use against. The doorbell rang. Once again, Johnny was jolted out of his daydream. He glanced quickly towards the front hall. Grandma heaved a deep, discontented sigh. Lord, I wonder who that is. She hated to be interrupted during meals. I'll go see, said Grandpa. He shoved his chair back and got up. Me too. He got up and followed his grandfather out the front door. He really had no reason to go along, but he went anyway, out of sheer, uncontrollable curiosity. Grandpa pulled at the front door, and it opened with a rattle. There on the snowy porch stood Professor Childermass. Professor Roderick Childermass, Ph.D. to be precise. Professor Childermass was a short, elderly, red-faced man. A wild nest of white hair covered the top of his head, and mutton-chop whiskers sprouted from the sides of his face. His nose was red and pitted and reminded Johnny of a strawberry. Perched slightly askew on the professor's head was an old, shapeless gray fedora, and thrown over his shoulders, sort of like a cape, was an unbelievably dirty and threadbare tweed overcoat. In his left hand, the professor clutched a shovel, or what had once been a shovel. It had been one of those little collapsible shovels that the army called an entrenching tool. But the red-colored blade had been battered into a shapeless mass of metal, and the hinged wooden handle was splintered and almost broken in two. "I am so angry that I can't see straight," the professor announced through clenched teeth. "I'm so angry that I'd like to murder someone." I hope you've enjoyed the first chapter of The Curse of the Blue Figurine, or at least it's so far. And in order to give you the best possible final product, I'm going to stop for now and do some editing in order to make this a bit more bearable to listen to. However, I will upload this file to YouTube in order to give you a taste of what this book has to offer. Once again, I'd like to reiterate that I am not taking credit for this, nor do I wish to do this for profit. However, I do enjoy reading, and I do enjoy reading aloud, and I do hope that you'll stay tuned as The Curse of the Blue Figurine unfolds. Thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful day.